Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We're talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today on the show, I'm joined by culture shaper Christopher Nguyen. Christopher, it's so great to have you on the show. And please let me know if I should actually be calling you Chris, because Christopher sounded very, very formal.
Yeah, Chris is fine. I'm glad to be here, Dan. Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure entirely. Now, it's fair to say that you're somewhat of a serial entrepreneur with your two most recent launches taking off in 2022. So give us a sense of your journey so far and what led you to these latest enterprises.
Absolutely. So I'm a business graduate. Well, I'm a computer science dropout turned business graduate turned designer. So non-traditional path to becoming a UX designer. So kind of bumbled around, found what I like to do, which is design, and worked in tech for about 10 years. And then actually, funny enough, went to an organization and hated it because of the toxic culture. And I left. And that was in 2020. And for the last 4 years, I've kind of been exploring what does it mean to be a professional kind of working for themselves. And so I started a bunch of things with friends as experiments, as they always are. So from an agile education startup to a Web3 startup to a YouTube agency, I joined a startup incubator, developed a SaaS tool. And through that journey, one thing stuck, which is what I'm working on now, which is UX Playbook, is kind of my take on education that's practical for UX designers, things that I wished I had at the beginning of my career. And then recently, I'm doing an experiment, and it's called Backlog. It's a community of design entrepreneurs building content businesses or building businesses from content. It just so happens it's also what I'm doing. So those are the two latest ventures that I'm thinking about a lot and working on.
So before we hit record, we were talking about the challenge of starting things versus finishing things. And I think this is a trait that probably you and I share, that I'm very much an ideas person, very naturally creative. I have massively improved my ability to complete and finish over the years. But talk to me about that tension in your world as that kind of creative entrepreneur and how you're balancing that now with maybe sticking to a path that you've revealed. You've gone through these experiments, you've found some things that you love, and now you've found a sense of direction. So how are you kind of making sure that you're sticking to that rather than kind of defaulting back into that, what maybe is kind of an easier space, like ideation space? I find that easier sometimes. So I can often find myself, even though I found a track, not doing the thing that I should be doing over here because I'm being attracted by the next idea that I've got over here. So how do you manage that tension within yourself?
It's really hard, and I don't know if I've nailed it or will ever nail it. But what happened through the last 4 years was UX Playbook organically grew, but I still didn't put like 100% of my energy inside it. Therefore, it took a lot of time of working on other things and it failing and basically half-arsing a bunch of projects for me to figure out, actually, UX Playbook is where I should double down. So really, I guess, going through that and failing at other projects and then one proving to work really helps because that's data-backed and, there's real evidence, right? So I think that was a huge shift for me. But then fundamentally, it was just to try and not separate. Really, like, okay, if you've laid the foundation for something, right? And then you're like, oh, I could easily replicate that somewhere else. But actually, it's just a huge assumption, right? The only proof is the evidence that you can kind of look back on, right? Everything else is like a hypothesis or assumption. So that shiny object syndrome happens to the best of us, happens to all creatives. But that's how I try to reframe things now. It's like, what is the actually likelihood of it happening? And me to basically because I've been working on this problem, a UX playbook, in terms of the problem in that business for around 2 years. What's the chance of, if I start something new or have or collaborate with someone, what's the chances that I'll be able to solve that problem the same? Because I think every business is fairly unique in the challenges they face. And sometimes you don't even know how you fix the original problem. Like, things just worked because you just started moving. So like, I'm always thinking, like, is this wise? Is this natural in terms of not only career progression, but also like company progression? So that's why I started Backlog, right? It was a more natural progression, and it's actually kind of where I want to be. So I'm okay starting things if I know I'm going to be in it for longer than I basically, if I can outlast it, right? If I can actually commit to it. So yeah, it's really hard. I don't have an answer for it. I'm still kind of learning as I go, but I'm definitely better at being like, I'm okay. I want to do the thing I'm doing versus, okay, let's start something together, because, for the last 4 years, that's what happened. Yeah.
I think you've hit on a great piece of advice. When you were speaking, you said it's kind of hard to identify what was working, but things fell into place because you were moving, because you were trying things, and then it sort of started to kind of come together or begin to emerge. It reminds me of a phrase that I often think about, which is, you can't steer a ship that's not moving. It's easier to steer a ship that is moving. And this idea that it can be really difficult to identify at times what works and why, unless you're kind of like just repeating the same patterns, iterating small things, and then looking back at the data, which most people who are starting something don't have the level of data that's required to really assess critically what's happening. And also, you probably haven't got the time to kind of constantly look back and evaluate. You've got to keep doing stuff, keep trying, and just rely on the fact that you'll get traction over time. You'll find your tribe over time, and big things will begin to fall into place. Now, fast forward a couple of years when your business has grown a bit, then maybe you can begin to look at the data. Maybe you have a critical mass in your audience where you can begin to A/B test things and begin to really get into the granular detail of a campaign or a launch. But actually, at first, it is really, really difficult. So my encouragement to anyone who's in my situation, starting Anthem, or your situation, Chris, is just stick at it for a bit. Try not to get too worried about analyzing the data, because actually you probably haven't got that critical mass in your audience yet where that's really, really valuable. And it also reminded me, as you were talking, that I'm sure you get this a lot. I certainly get this a lot, but I get a lot of DMs and I get a lot of traffic on my LinkedIn feed, which is people trying to give me their exact playbook for how they scaled their business. And what's really interesting about those things is that when you actually look at what they're teaching, at almost every level of their simplified playbook or their simplified strategy is something that requires adjacent skills. So it might be like, set up a landing page, just do this easy funnel, set up a landing page, make a video, and have a lead form. But there are 3 levels of skill that are required to make that thing a success. Building a landing page, being a copywriter, being a video editor, setting up your back end to kind of capture those leads into your, content management system. They are not simple things if you're coming at this for the first time, but they attract lots of people because lots of people who are in that founder mode, in that startup mode, are anxious about seeing success. They're anxious to get started. They're anxious to start making some sales. So very, very quickly, you're like, oh, I'm going to buy that course. It's on sale. It was $500. Now it's $99. Sign me up. I'm going in. And actually, those things work because when you jump into that kind of internet guru's funnel, there will always be a handful of people who have the adjacent skills to make the process work. So for every 100 people that sign up, there might be 5. Let's be generous and say there are 5 people who have the adjacent skills, who do the course, and then they give a testimonial at the end and they say, I followed this guy's exact process and it exploded my sales overnight. It's a true story, but it doesn't paint the full picture. And so I know that I've sort of gone on a bit of a rant there, probably about an adjacent thing that I'm passionate about at the moment. But what led me down that path is that idea that it is really confusing to focus on what works when you're just starting out. And to some extent, you've got to trust in the process ahead of you.
There's two things I want to add. The first thing is like, when you're starting out, there's probably some kind of goal, right? Whether it's like 100K in the next 12 months or, 10K in the next 3 months, whatever it is. But I think that's the wrong way to approach it. A better way to approach it would be, I'm just going to do this thing X amount of time, because you can actually control that versus that result at the end, because you never really know what it's going. And talking about these adjacent skills, as you start to do the thing, whatever it is, like build X business or write content online, you will then develop those skills alongside it. So you're not saying, I want to make money online and this is the amount by the end of the year. What you're saying is like, I'm going to spend 30 minutes a day writing and posting on LinkedIn. And therefore, the skills that you kind of accumulate and the opportunities just kind of organically come because you're working at it. You're like, okay, well, how do I make a better hook? How you end up learning the nuances of the platform or whatever you're doing. So like, that's one thing. Actually like setting goals that are attainable, that is actually about the process and not about the outcome. So I think that's really important. So that's getting started. And then the second thing about a lot of people buy courses as because they want to get started. There's some sort of blocker in their head, and usually it's mental. And I attribute this to procrastination. Like buying the course versus doing the thing is actually procrastinating. Because a lot of the times, and going back to what you mentioned earlier, which is you don't know what problem you're solving until you're trying to solve the problem. You can plan for the problem, but if you're not dealing with that problem, you really don't know like how to navigate it. So people just like buy the thing because they're like, oh, I need an email funnel in order to sell my digital products. Well, do you? Right? Like, what else have you tried? So like you're assuming that there's a problem, or I need, a business or economics 101 to start a business. I need to learn financing, right? I need to learn accounts. I need to learn about taxes. Well, why don't you just start a business and then figure that stuff out, because you probably don't need it now. So a lot of folks I speak to that want to start is actually just all in their head. And they're like, no, I need to read the book first. I need to do the course first. I need to build a personal brand first. And I'm like, no, you don't need any of that. You just need to start the thing, like whatever the thing is. And then you'll figure that stuff out, because then you're like, oh, I need to plug that gap. I don't have an audience. I should probably build an audience, right? I don't have a digital product. I don't have a coaching offering, like whatever it is, you really don't know. So like, however cliche it is, just do the thing. That's it. Like, that's really the secret sauce. But there's so much information that is also like, it just stops people from doing it. And it's usually just in their head.
I think this is going to be such a breath of fresh air for people who are in that startup phase, who are listening to this. Obviously, we talk about bigger subjects on Culture Crush. I'm going to be talking about leadership challenges and who your culture crush is, for example. But in these early stages, that is such a fresh take on this world, which is so prevalent at the moment. And I think there are lots of people who are going to listen to this episode. And what you've just said, Chris, is going to give them that sense of relief that actually they don't need to spend all their time worrying about whether they've got the right course or they're doing the right thing. You're actually saying, look, just don't worry about that. Focus on what's in front of you. And actually, I think that's how Alex Hermosi says it. Out of all the kind of internet gurus, and I don't really pay attention that much to any of them, but there are some things that I've heard Alex Hermosi say that have rung true for me. And I think he echoes the sentiment you were just getting at about don't focus on the outcome. Don't focus on the money. Focus on the thing that's controllable. Focus on the thing that's in front of you. And things that you can control is, like you say, how much time can you commit to a course, not a course, but a route of learning. What amount of time can you commit to just beginning to get your message out there and see how people are responding to it? You don't need to become an overnight expert. You don't need to like build a course right away. You don't need to as you say, worry about like building a funnel right away. Just start getting the message out there. Focus on just getting that task done and see how that goes. And I loved what you also said. I just wrote this down that, courses, I might be summarizing here, but about courses being a form of procrastination.
It
I think
absolutely
that
is.
is,
It absolutely is.
that's a moment of cut through genius. Now, moving on, I can't quite recall the moment or the post that inspired me to reach out to you. I'm very glad I did, but it was like we were just talking before we hit record, that it was at least 6 weeks ago. So there was a post at some point that I'd seen that you'd written, and I thought, Chris seems like a great guy. I need to have a conversation with him. But as I kind of got to know you and your online presence and the businesses that you're building, you've built this community now of, you're nearing, I think, 70,000 members, which is wild. I mean, that's such incredible growth. And I'm wondering, as you've sort of led this community of people who are tuning into those UX design messages and who are looking to you for a sense of leadership and guidance in this space and helping them find their feet, give us an idea of what you're trying to get done there, but also, what surprised you and what's been challenging with that growth and kind of becoming a leader in this space.
Yeah, well, where do I start? So much to kind of address there. I think what I'm trying to do is, like, in terms of like product and my offering, is really to help folks that can't afford, say, like a boot camp. If you are starting from zero, some people just like structured learning, right? Like, they can't seem to connect the dots. Also, when you're new, you don't know what you don't know. So structured learning helps. However, like, boot camps are extortionate. They're like £3,000 plus, some are like 15 grand. So I'm trying to offer a more accessible way. And typically boot camps teach you the happy path of designing. So it's like input, output, the design, guys. And it's like, well, that's not how it works. So what I try to do is say, okay, here are some tools, learn the tools really well, or learn the frameworks. And then once you come up across that problem, here's this framework you can use, and then change and adapt as you're maturing in your knowledge and the multiple times you've been through this problem, right? So this is all the way from like building a portfolio, interviewing for a job, to leading a team. So that's kind of what UX Playbook is about. And then the challenges around kind of doing this is that the design industry is quite funny. And there's a lot of purist designers, right? Ones that are like, this is the right way to do it. Like, you should do this, you shouldn't do that stuff. So, you get a lot of hate from other quote unquote design leaders out there. And I'm fine with that. I don't really give a shit what they think. I'm just basically telling my story. And that's really all I can do is like, hey, this worked for me. And I've kind of like crystallized it down, but it might not work for you, but this is my take. And I think that's kind of the key, where you teach what you know, and then that's kind of it. So like, I'm trying to do that. I'm not going to teach someone how to grow their business to $1 million. Haven't done that yet. But when I've done that, I probably have a few cents to add to that problem, right? Or that solution. So, and then in terms of leading it, I think it's just this, like, fundamentally, as I was saying, like, people who wanted to start business don't. People who want to start design or pretty much do anything, they actually just need permission to do it. And they actually need to not treat themselves so seriously and be so anxious about the thing, right? And just kind of do it. So I think one of my jobs as this quote unquote leader, if you will, is just to kind of push that message out. It's like, here's how many times I failed, right? Like, that, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, you can only look back. At the time it sucks, but like, just keep moving forward and keep doing what you can do. And I love this community of designers. That's because I'm also self-taught. So basically, I just kind of grabbed as much information as I could, but I didn't do that to begin with, right? I didn't study for 10 years and try to get a PhD and then to go do the thing. I just did the thing and then filled in whatever gaps I thought I had. I still have gaps, right? I'm not the best like user researcher, for example, right? That doesn't really matter to me, right? So I think yeah, not really sure what the message is there, but I really just kind of want to help these like self-taught guys feel more confident, right? And then with confidence, they can pretty much do anything. I think that's really it. Like whether or not you find my material that helpful, you'll probably outgrow it anyway, right? So yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And then in terms of like longer term vision, like UX Playbook is a great starting point for designers who want to go through portfolios, job interviews, or even lead their first design teams. But then I want to graduate them and actually elevate designers to become business owners, creators, CEOs, founders, right? And take them into this community that I'm building called Backlog, because like developers and creative people, you just like to make things, right? And I think there should be more designers in the field creating opinionated products, launching awesome things. And because we can deliver the final product, so it's like it makes sense for designers to also be doing this and to solve problems in different ways that the market doesn't really care about, but we care about it, right? Or a certain section of people care about it. So like, yeah. So like, it's very natural progression to like designers leveling up in their career to them like doing their own thing through this other venture I'm thinking about. So hopefully that would be the message that is like underlining through. It's like, hey, just get started, do the thing, and then realize that the 9 to 5 sucks, and then go do your own thing. So yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
When you said before, you said, I'm not sure what the message is behind this, as you were kind of explaining it. And what I heard you talking about is the fact that the world of design it's a little bit like a walled garden, right? It feels inaccessible. It feels like the pathways that some people get to walk through formal education or through rising up through the ranks from a business. There's kind of set pathways, but for everyone else, it feels a little bit exclusive. It's hard to kind of get into or figure out, how do I get over this wall? There's not a clear pathway for me into this world. And I think what you're doing is a couple of things. The first part, you mentioned this around having permission, having confidence, sort of saying yes to yourself when you're approaching that world. So I think there's a sense of creating for permission for people, or maybe not creating permission for people, but revealing that they have permission, right? It's kind of revealing the power that they already have. And then the second thing is, Canva's done obviously incredible things in recent years in the terms of the democratization of design, making it more accessible for people. And I feel like you're doing a similar thing for people. You're kind of bringing a level of democracy to the design world and reducing that barrier to entry, bringing that wall down. You're saying you have permission and we're lowering the wall for you. And so I think it's a great mission to take on, and it's has a really powerful sense of virtue to it. So, I applaud what you're doing. Now, we are, though, going to talk about culture. And the reason why I called you a culture shaper at the beginning of this call is because you are leading this group of 70,000 people, almost 70,000 people now. And you, whether you intended to or not, you have become a culture shaper in the design world. And so I'm just wondering, thinking about your culture crush and which organizational person you think could qualify as your culture crush and why. So why don't you tell us about who you've been thinking of in terms of your culture crush?
Yeah, but I had this crush for a long time, this culture crush. So it's Jason Fried from 37 Signals. He's my crush, but also the company he's built is my crush. So let me just tell you about this. Great writer. And the reason why I like the company, like his product, like the things he built, because it's very opinionated. So it's all around the philosophy of how he approaches things, right? Like whether it's his book Remote or Shape Up, doesn't have to be crazy at work. It's like baked in storytelling and philosophy. And then this basically filters down through the company and the products he builds. And if you know some of the stuff that he's launching recently, like he's launched a email app, hey.com, and then also once.com, where you buy software once versus renting it, like subscription businesses. So everything he builds is very opinionated and very purposeful. And just so happens he's also a designer and is a CEO. And he's been working on this bootstrap business for about 20 plus years. The only person that invested was Jeff Bezos, but that's like a really tiny stake. So I like that it's independent at its core. And there's basically two co-founders, an engineer and a designer, and they're avid writers of building companies in different ways than you're used to. So they're quite contrarian in a way. And I kind of like that, because when you listen to a lot of startup advice, especially in the YC world and like the VC world, it's always do this, like raise money, like do this. They're completely switched it. And they're like, you know what, we're a small business. We don't need to like grow so much that we charge people an arm and a leg. It's just so different. And I think that's why I got attracted to it. And some of the things, when you read it or you listen to them, you can't help but nod along, right? And you're like, I've never heard this before, but I actually agree with a lot of things they have. So that's my culture crush. I'm not sure if you know about them, Dan, but they are amazing.
It is a new one on me.
Okay.
And what I'm going to say is, Jason, if you get the chance to see this episode, I can't imagine how it would land on your feed, but we hope it will, because Chris and I would love to host you and have a conversation with you for a future episode of Culture Crush. That would be amazing. No, I love the example, because that kind of counterculture approach is so important. It's so refreshing. I mean, you've been representing part of that in some of the things that you've been saying on this episode, and I've been nodding along with you. I love how you were reflecting on Jason and 37 Signals' countercultural voice in the startup world, about finding new ways to do things, thinking differently about positioning their businesses, positioning how they bring people into their world in new ways, not overpricing things, not trying to behave like all the other kind of startup companies out there, because there is this kind of well-trodden narrative around startup culture at the moment. And it's kind of hard for new ideas and creative thinkers and countercultural thinkers to break through. So I really love the fact that you've highlighted them, and I would encourage anybody to go and check them out. I will be. It's a new one on me. I'll be going to check out. Jason Fried, did you say? Was that his name?
Yeah, Jason Fried, spelled like fried. Yeah.
Jason Fried, spelled like fried, 37 Signals. I'm going to check it out. Now, as we've said a couple of times now, one of the reasons why I was so excited to speak to you is because you are leading this very, very large community of designers, democratizing that design space, bringing a sense of opportunity and permission to that world. So I know that you've been thinking about the question of leadership challenges and solutions. So why don't you talk to us about what you see as a leadership challenge in the world of culture at the moment, and just bounce straight into what you think is the solution. Like, what's the practical stuff that people can take away and try in order to address that challenge?
Sure. So two things, two major challenges that I faced in my own teams and just working with folks. Really hard, especially in the world of remote work. My team is fully remote. So one is building sort of this sort of team vibe, let's just call it vibe, or a sense of like oneness, right? That's really hard. And then the second, when people say you have to celebrate failures, right? Actually, I don't agree with that. What you need to celebrate, or what you need to focus on, is the learning from failures. You don't just celebrate like, oh, I just threw a bunch of money here and it didn't work. Like, that's not what should be celebrated. The critical part is what you learn from the failure, right? So those two things I think are very hard. The first one, obviously, this team element. How do you build a sense of oneness? And then the second is like, well, what do you do with this thing called failure? How do you celebrate it? How do you well, we're not supposed to celebrate it, actually. Like, how do you extract the learning from it? And how do you make failure useful for teams? So those are the two things I want to solve. And my solution, and I do this every week, I do this in the community that I started. And I've been doing this for years, since 2018, I believe. One is wins, and the next is fuck ups. Okay. And I'll talk about wins first. So we do this every week, as a recap, as a start of, like, let's just say a team meeting, right? We're like, okay, wins and fuck ups. So let's talk about wins first. Wins is sharing personal and professional things that went well. So if you're a CEO, you could be like, oh, this thing happened really well in the company. If you're a manager, you could be like, oh, this one of my team members did great. And then for personally, you could say, oh, I just passed my driving test, whatever it is, right? So you really want to build a culture of, like, clapping and applauding for each other and good things to that, like celebrating progress, celebrating momentum. And this is even more important when you're remote, because you don't really know that person, or that, like, especially when you've just started, right? So wins is a way to also get to know the person. What do they care about? What are they celebrating? And then, like, trying to be this leader, you can tell them what's going on by saying, hey, you're basically saying, if we hit this target and if that was a win, this they will then understand that to be important to me, right? And then when they share a win, I'll understand that to be important to them. So that kind of builds a sense of, like, positivity and like bonding through applauding for each other. So it could be, and definitely there's some sort of recognition in there if you applaud for someone else. So that's just winning, right? Like celebrating that winning culture, building that sort of desired behavior by recognizing things that we did well. The next is fuck ups, right? This was inspired by this movement called Fuck Up Nights, where a bunch of entrepreneurs basically had, like, a dinner, and they basically shared failure stories about how they screwed up in entrepreneurship, how they burned all their money and closed the company down. And then the movement got so popular, they're in like 40 different countries, 150 different cities. And I saw this concept and I was like, this is super interesting. Like, I love that in terms of, hey, admitting to what went wrong, but more than that, celebrating that failure, because that's not the key there. The learning from it. What are you going to do differently, right? And I do this on a micro level, on like week to week. So every single week, we start our meetings with wins and fuck ups, because we want to know, what did we screw up? It's actually okay. Like psychological safety wise, it's fine to admit that you fucked up. But what are you going to do about it? What did you learn? So we don't make that mistake again, because we're building collective wisdom here. And over time, you can find, like now with AI, you can just search your database and you can find all the failures and what you learn from it, right? Like, what are you going to prevent earlier? And then if that thing happens twice, you know you need to build a system. First time is fine, human error, right? But and then you can like, basically prevent that from happening again. So those are the two things I do every single Monday, just as a team exercise, to sort of, one, build that unity and to celebrate what's going well, because sometimes, business is hard, right? So you need that kind of boost, and for your team members. And then the second is like, okay, well, I know we screwed up this week. Like, it's fine. Like, everybody screws up, but what do we learn from it? And then how can I help you as well, right? So those are the two things.
There's a couple of things that I think I really like about this approach. With the wins, what I really like is this sense of bringing both the personal and the professional into the mix. So care is a crucial dynamic in any team. And the only way that you can develop care is by knowing things about the other people in your team. It's not just about your professional endeavors together or your professional exploits. It's like, Chris, if I know a bit about your life, if I know the name of your cat, for example, and then I can ask after when we get back together on Monday, say, oh, how's the cat this weekend? You're much more likely, when I say I need help, you're much more likely to create room for me. So it's not about care in order to get that outcome of support, but it's what kind of greases the wheels of those relationships. And it allows you to be there for each other, to stand up for each other, to clap for one another when you're not just clapping professional accomplishments. So I think the introduction of personal wins and those things is so important. And on the other side of it, the fuck ups, I love how you're framing I love how you're not giving permission to failure. You're almost saying kind of, we can live with failure. Failure is going to happen and we can accommodate that, but we're not going to, the silver lining is what can we learn from it? The silver lining isn't great. We made a big mistake. And I think one of the ways that translates for me is you often hear people when they reflect on their personal story is they'll say, if I could help just one person, it would have all been worth it, right? This is another way that people kind of adjust and accommodate failure. And what I've always thought to myself, so I used to work, in the NGO world, right? And people would say things like that all the time. Like, we set up an initiative and if it helps just one person, it would have been worth it. And it feels good. It sounds good. It sounds real. But one day I thought to myself, but hang on a minute. We didn't set out to help one person. We set up to help 1,000 people. So if we actually only help one person, that represents a pretty catastrophic failure, if we're being honest. Like, if I owned an orchard, right, and I planted all these apple trees and one tree produced one apple, I wouldn't go, hey, I did it. What a great success. I got an apple out of it. You wouldn't do that. You'd plow the whole thing and you'd start again. And so I think there is a lovely sense of realism that you're taking us through about acknowledging failure, but actually looking for the real silver lining, which is what can we learn from that? And I think as well, by making it a weekly part of your rhythm, by making it something that everybody returns to every week, it also signals to everyone else in the team that we all fuck up. It's okay. It's not okay. We want to change those things. But in another sense, it is okay because we're in this together. And we're going to applaud you when you do things well. And we're going to be open with each other about when we get things wrong. And we're going to be there to support one another. So I think this is great. The team vibe and focus on learning, I think they are two. I love them because they're so practical. Like, any business owner, any leader could literally start a meeting next week, right? Plan it, do it next week with those wins and with those fuck ups. But obviously, maybe pick another word depending on the type of business that you are in.
Pro tip. If you're starting fuck ups, this is hard, right? Wins easy, right? Everybody's like, oh, boss, I did really well. But fuck ups, not that easy. So the trick is, if you've just started it, you're the first one to own up, right? You're the first one to be like, this is my fuck up. And it will be a silent room because people aren't used to admitting to their failures in front of their boss, in front of the CEO, in front of whoever it is, right? And it's kind of an ego thing. But soon as you've done it and rinsed it multiple times and you're the one owning up to it and you should go first as a leader, then you give permission for folks to also let their guard down, right? And because if you do work in a company and things aren't reported, like let's say you're moving quite fast as a startup and things aren't reported and you could have fixed it, 48 hours before the event happened that led to whatever other event, you need to prevent that. And that's why this kind of weekly ritual is so critical, especially for faster moving things, because you need to discover the problem and really, because there could be, a domino effect. So I love it. And I think it's more important than the win. Like, the win is great. Like, it feels good, but the fuck up is actually the thing that you want to build as a rhythm. People saying to you, hey, this went wrong. Like, can you help me? Or like, what do we do? So yeah, sorry, just pro tip there.
No, I love that. Yeah, there's that phrase. It may be Simon Sinek that said this, but maybe I am attributing a quote to him that isn't his. I'm not sure. But there's a phrase which is leaders eat last, which is a lovely way of visualizing the role of the leader is to go last, to let other people go first, to hold the door open for others to join the table when everyone else has taken their seat. Lovely way of framing it. But maybe we should add an addendum to that, which is, and they share fuck ups first, right? Maybe it's leaders eat last and share their fuck ups first. I think that's kind of a nice catchphrase for people to take away from today's episode. We've covered a lot of ground, some incredible value. So thank you for sharing all your thoughts with us. But we love to finish on something really, really practical for people to take away and try. Now, I kind of think we've already done this. So this might be just reiterating something you've already said, like your last point about how to go first is so practical. That might be the top takeaway. But just in case you've got anything else you wanted to add, what's the one thing that people should take away and do today to get started with responding to this kind of challenge?
I think the one takeaway, and I'm not sure if it's practical, but it's a bit of more of like an approach or how you should think about it. So the story is like, there was no such thing as fuck ups in terms of like in my team, right? I introduced it because I basically saw this community and this movement, and I was like, that's really interesting. Why can't we implement it? So the takeaway here is like, you should just try the thing before you determine if it would work or not, right? Goes back to that point of like, people just don't want to start because they're worried about XYZ. You know, they're procrastinating by buying a course or attending this thing. You don't actually need that. Like, what you need is the mindset of experimentation, because everything is actually in your head until it's real, right? So I think that's the number one takeaway, whether it's in a business, whether it's in a new venture, like you're learning something or anything like that, or even when it comes to like, I want to build a kick-ass culture, right? You could read a bunch of culture books, or you can actually try and do it, right? And experiment with different things to build desired like behaviors, for example. So it's that spirit of experimentation, and that I don't see enough, especially because culture is this subject of like, when you start a company, it's like, write your mission and values on the wall, right? And like culture of recognition. But like sometimes that stuff doesn't work. So what do you do, right? Like, so yeah, a culture of experimentation is actually, I think, a healthier way to go about this. When you're coming up with leadership challenges, because there isn't a one size fit all solution, and sometimes there isn't a best practice. We're dealing with humans at the end of the day, so one human and another one will be very, very different. So what is that experiment that you're going to run to figure out if it works?
And I think I would add to that, let the team know that you're introducing an experiment. So rather than kind of saying, I'm legislating this new idea, we're going to do this every week from now on, and this is the new law, I'm coming in as your authoritarian, all-knowing leader. No, maybe just like, let's scale that right back. Say to the team, we're going to try this experiment for a few weeks and see how it goes. Allow them to participate in whether this decision is the right one. Allow them to have a voice in whether this is working for them. Help, democratize that process, involve them. And actually, it will just set the right level of expectation and create enough room for forgiveness if it doesn't work. You can then say, oh, that didn't work, did it, guys? Let's move on. So I think that is also a really good way to implement it. Chris, we are about to wrap. We're coming into land. And I just wanted to say it's been such a fantastic conversation. And thank you for making some time for Culture Crush. And let's speak again soon.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure. And I could speak about this topic all day. So, but yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks, man.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a Culture First leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.